In this video, I'm going to go through what I think is going to destroy the Democratic Party. If not this year, then in the next 2 years. So, for context, I was a registered Republican in a swing state for several years. I didn't vote in an election until 2024, where I voted for Kamala Harris. And I think my trajectory might be informative to why I've come to this view. So, I registered as a Republican initially not because I was really aligned with their party, but more because I was very concerned with the status quo of the Democratic Party, which was to increasingly table American values and bigger picture sort of economic prospect or conservative values that are worth adhering to at the behest of left-wing influences in the party. And being from a swing state, I felt like those views were severely overestimated in the sense that while there were definitely left cores in cities, the average Democrat had no interest in the politics of someone like Bernie Sanders, especially when it came to social issues. I'm more of an econ guy when it comes to policy and what I vote on, but it was more of a trend of adhering to and appealing to these left values, whatever. And the Trump stuff, I was, sympathetic to a lot of the energy that projected into the first Trump run in 2015 through 2016. But, after January 6th and learning more and going through sort of the ropes, I became incredibly disenfranchised with Trump and any element of the GOP post 2020, and I had a lot of increased sympathy for the Democratic Party and seeing great work by the Democratic Party in my home state. This then evolved into seeing the Biden admin and disagreeing with some elements, but seeing a lot of success and being really impressed by their ability, especially Biden's capacity to control Congress and to really get legislation passed with slim, if not adverse, if not totally opposed numbers, in the House and Senate. And this led me to eventually registering as a Democrat and, totally showing the Republican sympathies I had. The problem is that I fear that people like myself, as well as others, will have no choice in the future and will return back to the Republican Party because of the ideology of people like Ilhan Omar. This isn't to say that Ilhan Omar is a particularly interesting person when it comes to ideology or as a thought leader in her own right. Rather, she is just the perfect sort of foot soldier for the ideology I'm talking about. And there is a name to what I'm describing, and the term might sound contentious, but I would just ask you to hear me out. I would call it race communism. When you say a word like that, it seems very id pol based, very perhaps just reactionary, whatever. But let me explain why it's distinct. When the Western world refers to communism, they're talking about Marxism, specifically either Marxist-Leninism or Maoism. These two strings of communist ideology are rooted in the Marxist principle of dialectical materialism. And this goes deep because the early Marxist thinkers through the later Marxist thinkers almost all uniformly agree that the only element of orthodox Marxism is a strict adherence to dialectical materialism. And what that is for another video. But for the purpose of this video, the result of dialectical materialism is a class reductionism, meaning that you can take political problems and always reduce them to class conflict. In simple terms, a master and slave dialectic, or a master and slave competition in more normal terms. That is a problem in of itself, but it's at least a ideological core that is debatable. Race communism is a distinct, seemingly 21st century ideology that's very much entwined with the growth of social media, which is this weird fusion of the aesthetics and the application of Marxism, or at least Marxist-Leninist communism, with race-based idpol, or identity politics. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that you have this growing contingency of people, and it's not just people online or on accounts, but people actually in Congress who are now proposing these sort of Marxist class-based arguments, but the underlying ideology is this identity politics, specifically on the topic of race or nationality sometimes, class struggle. And in practice, this means that in traditional Marxist, analysis, when you say go to international politics, you're always thinking about class, meaning that if you have a state that is not your own, you're always asking first and foremost, are they with or against us? Are they with the Marxist coalition or not? And you adjust your analysis based on that. So with a contentious state like Israel, there was a period of time where they were floating with the Second World, with the USSR. And for a purely ML, traditional Marxist analysis, if Israel had allied with the Second World, of course there'd be some qualifiers, but that would be accepted as a legitimate state to defend, to align with, because they would be a part of the bigger picture of, class-based politics, class warfare. But for race communists like Ilhan Omar, it's not that. You reduce it to a West versus other, a West versus Eastern, a white versus non-white. And it's an incredibly concerning reductionism because it strips any ideological core, because you're no longer having a debate. You're now in this weird world where, you're not just debating or seeing a Marxist as your opponent, but as someone who uses Marxist terminology without any commitment to it. Let me delve with it a little bit further. With class-based analysis, at the very least, you always understand where they're coming from. You understand that if you're aligned with the state of Iran, it's not like you're supporting the, obscene elements of Sharia law or of the cleric-based system of authority. Rather, they understand Iran as a part of a different class dynamic, that they are helping to erode capitalism. That might not be something that you or I agree with, but at the very least, I understand that perspective. A discussion can be had. But for people like Ilhan Omar and other race communists, it's not about that. It's because they're non-Western, they're brown or whatever. And you might say that's a very cynical view. That's a very and they pretend like it's not that, of course, but that's what's going on. And before you say, oh, that's just a bias from you, or whatever, or something comparable, I bring to this tweet. So, Ilhan Omar was the only Democrat recently to vote against a Ukrainian aid package. For context, Ukraine is fighting in a war of defense against a Russian imperialist project that is trying to literally destroy their state. And Ilhan Omar voted against this aid package. And part of the aid package had increased sanctions. Let's read her response to that. I have always and will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people and unequivocally condemn Putin's illegal and brutal invasion. I voted against the Ukraine Support Act because of its inclusion of broad economic sanctions. Time and again, sanctions like these fail to achieve their stated goal while inflicting real suffering on ordinary people. Opposing Russian aggression does not require us to support policies that punish ordinary civilians who do not ask for this war. The foreign policy establishment continues to return the same failed playbook and expects different results. Economic sanctions fail to achieve their desired goals and in most cases are counterproductive to ending war. I remain committed to supporting diplomacy, peace, and justice for the Ukrainian people affected by this horrific conflict. But I could not in good conscience support legislation that wages economic warfare on innocent civilians. So, in a second world forward or third worldist even version of Marxist-Leninism, This view is reasonable. It totally would be. However, Ilhan Omar supports sanctions for Israel. She aggressively supports the BDS movement, which is literally boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, that calls for some of the strictest sanctions possible for a country against Israel, has supported sanctions outside of BDS, and openly thinks that Israel should not exist as a state, which, again, those things on their own, totally understandable views depending on your ideological background. So, why is this a problem? Well, in what world could you ever see the way that Russia is conducting war in Ukraine? Which, again, you could hate Israel as much as you want, but any sober mind will tell you, if you show them the facts, that Russia is conducting warfare in Ukraine. And that's before getting even to their reason for being in war. But they're conducting war in Ukraine in such a absurdly inhuman way it hasn't been seen since World War II. It's far worse than Israel. You can hate Israel and you can hate Russia. You can hate both in terms of their warfare conduct. But Russia, it's far worse. And it's not a debate. It's true. So you would wonder, why is a sitting representative, and again, a sitting representative should be someone who is, if anyone, more curtailed to the way they express themselves, more careful about the word choices they use. Why would she not only vote this way, but then offer this kind of response? And it sounds stupid, but the simple answer is race communism. The reality is, these people see Ukrainians as white. They see Russians as white. And you know what that means? They don't care. It's like Adam Friedland and Hassan Piker made a joke about that. That sounds like white people stuff. That's a you would think that's like a joke, but it's actually what they said. Meanwhile, Adam Friedland then had Richie Torres and to have a struggle session about Israel, a war that by death toll and brutality is incomparable to what is happening in Russia and Ukraine, and none of these people care about it. And the reason Ilhan Omar would make such an obvious hypocrisy public is because she knows her supporters do not care. They, in turn, are also race communists in the sense that they believe in utopic communism for people who are non-white, non-Western. And the inverse, they don't think that Western people should be provided privileges in any respect. It's so naked because, again, in this statement, she understands why sanctions can be harmful. And I agree, sanctions can be really brutal for citizens. And I don't blame the average Russian for the war in Ukraine. But in that same way, how could you ever have the opposite view for a country by any objective metric, that is, by any objective metric, conducting warfare in a significantly less brutal and inhumane way? No matter how bad you think it is, it's not as bad as what Russia is doing. To bring things back in, I want to connect this back to the Democratic Party because what's so scary about this is not that it's even being said on its own. It's that people like Ilhan Omar feel comfortable openly supporting these sort of contradictory opinions that are blatantly anti-American interests. The reason why I'm so impassioned about this is because I believe in American liberalism. I believe in American cosmopolitanism. I believe that people of different races, ethnicities, religions can live in harmony. I believe in all of those things, which means that we have to have universal standards. We have to have, at the very least, consistent standards. When we start doing this oppressor versus oppressee or master versus slave dynamic, but then also just extrapolating it to a racial or national or hemisphere-based, categorization, we are sliding back into pre-Enlightenment notions of what it means to be a person or what ideology means. And that's terrifying. And the reason someone like Ilhan Omar can do it comfortably is because this sort of language, when done in a leftist manner, is seen as socially as appropriate because leftists, broadly speaking, use more humane language. The right wing will be open about their distaste. They will be open about their inhumanity. But that makes it so that those opinions are not safe for public discourse. They're not safe to be attached with a face or identity. But for people like Ilhan Omar, this sort of, I would call it brutish race communism, that is, anti-Ukrainian in this case, is accepted and it's embraced. And the problem is the Democratic Party is not course correcting. They're not adjusting. They're diving head on. They're not only allowing this, they're enabling it. People who are trying to become more prominent voices in the party, like AOC, they might not say something this aggressive at this point, but how do we know they don't just agree with this but won't say it? They're in these shared coalitions, literally in terms of caucuses and ideologically in terms of their orientation. Say you get a Democratic House that is even just 1/6 in agreement on these issues. Well, how do you know they won't jump on this if they gain power, if they get a majority leader who is of this ilk, if they get a Senate majority of this ilk, or God forbid they get a president who agrees with this? How do you know they won't act on this? How do you know they won't change the structure like that? At that point, what can a good American do? They can't stand by and allow that in the same way that a good American can't stand by and allow MAGA. And this isn't a centrist talking point. It's that I'm worried that the Democratic Party is going to be destroyed when right now it is the only vanguard available against MAGA, the only vehicle that we can course correct America through. And if we get to 2028 and we just have two sides of the same coin when we don't currently, then there will be no future. Then the experiment of America, the greatness of America, will have failed. So again, this video is a little all over the place, I guess, but I hope my argument is at least a little convincing. And, agree, disagree with the semantics or the terminology, let me know. I'd be happy to respond to any comments. This is something that's very, I'm very focused on right now because I think this is really the sort of like battle for the soul of the party that is happening right now ahead of these midterms. And, I don't know if we're going to come across that line while being intact. I'm very concerned. So, let me know if you think those concerns are unfounded. Like, subscribe, comment. I appreciate it all. And yeah, I'll see you in the videos tomorrow. Have a nice day or night.